Want to expand the reach of your content? Start a podcast. Feature industry experts on your show and leverage the influence and reach of your guests to grow your brand. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to the B2B Growth Show. I'm your host for today's episode, Logan Lyles with Sweetfish Media. I'm joined today by Adam Goyette. He is the VP of Marketing at G2 Crowd. Adam, how you doing today, man?
I'm good, Logan. Nice chatting with you again.
It is a pleasure to have you on, man. We were chatting sales and marketing alignment last time you were on the show. Definitely a fun conversation and excited to chat with you today about something that's real in my world, real in your world. So I know we're going to have a valuable conversation for a lot of listeners talking about 4 ways to manage chaos in a fast growing startup. But before we do that, for folks who didn't hear your last episode, aren't familiar with you or G2 Crowd, tell us a little bit about your background and what you guys are up to there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am VP of Marketing at G2 Crowd. So I oversee kind of all of our demand gen efforts, customer marketing, social, field marketing, all those fun things. And G2 Crowd, really exciting place. I think, we are a review platform, but really a lot more than that, right? We really provide the data, really at the heart of it, a data company. If you think about all the reviews we're collecting, all the data that's providing, all the insights we can have on the back end of, who's looking at what software company, it's really powerful. And we're doing some really cool things with that with our buyer intent data. And then, in Q4 of last year, we acquired a company called Siftery, which actually called Track and allows basically even more data, right? Of like, what is your software tech stack, right? And understanding like, where's your spend going, who's managing these platforms, who's using it. So like it gives CFOs really good insights into like, where are we spending money on SaaS products? And I think most people would be pretty shocked. So I think that's definitely a valuable aspect to bring into the fold for the company. So yeah, we're doing some big things at G2 Crowd.
Yeah, absolutely. You guys have had quite the ride over the last year. And so, that makes sense that it stands to reason that you'd have some things to share about managing chaos in a fast growing company. As you and I were talking last, you mentioned, all of the different aspects that you're responsible for in the marketing team that you're running there at G2 Crowd. For folks who maybe need a little bit of preface, let's set the stage a little bit before we get into these 4 specific strategies and pause on, why do you feel like this is important to talk about with the nature of fast growing companies?
Yeah, I think it's super important for a couple of reasons. One is when you think about like fast growing companies, there's always a lot of projects. There's always a lot of things to get done, right? You're a startup company, so you're probably not, don't have a marketing team that's 200 people that can do all these things. So the scope of what you're trying to do and the amount of people and bandwidth you actually have to get it done makes it very difficult, right? And then we're always throwing new things into the mix, whether it be new features, acquisitions, all these interesting things. And really like the importance of kind of managing chaos is chaos will always kind of be there. And doing that appropriately, I think helps you scale a lot faster because you have processes, you have an intake machine for all the chaos. And then the other piece of it, I think really kind of goes to stability for your team. If you think about kind of life at a high growth startup or people who work at startups, a lot of times when people leave startups and they post that they're taking a 6-month hiatus to go do something else, it's a lot of time like burnout, right? And it's like, well, they've only been at the company for 1.5 years or 2 years. But I think when you're don't have a system in place, it's very easy to burn out team members because on top of the high workload, if it's not managed accordingly, you're almost doubling, tripling kind of, what that workload is. So I think those are really the key components, I think, of why it's so important, right? Is like keeping your employees happy, keeping people on your team happy, keeping your own sanity going, as well as like trying to scale as quickly as possible.
Yeah, we can get very focused on, okay, we can scale this, there's this much demand, but at the end of the day, it's humans that make up the business, and we have, we have needs, emotional needs, we have, our max capacity to handle things. So you've got to manage, the whole person of everyone on your team. What you touched on there reminds me something I heard from Craig Groeschel on his leadership podcast recently, and he talked about you either have systems by default or you have them on purpose. Even if you don't have a system on purpose and by intention, there is a system by default. And maybe that system is creating a new system every time something comes your way. And that dovetails right into your point of you can triple the workload just by not setting up systems and processes to learn from what you're doing now to incrementally make it better, because you're always reinventing the wheel. So I think there's a lot of good advice there. So let's talk about some ways that people can actually manage this chaos. Our team has been recently reading the 4 Disciplines of Execution, and the way that book breaks this down is, to your point, Adam, there will always be chaos to manage. There will always be trying to achieve that next, what they call in that book, your WIG, your wildly important goal. But there still is the day-to-day that you have to just maintain what you have going, whether you're at an established company or a fast-growing startup. So managing the chaos of that whirlwind is always tough. So one of the keys I know you wanted to share, Adam, is delegation. Tell us a little bit about how you go about that systematically with your team.
Yeah, I think with my team, it's really important, right? I think a lot of times, I'm at the front end of the kind of the spear in terms of like dealing with leadership and the sales team and taking in a lot of these requests. And really, like, I'm one person, and this goes for anyone, really. It's not like you can't scale one person. And so I think like it's super important to have really talented, strong people around you can trust, and that allows you to delegate more. And so really, like, my goal is like passing these projects off to people who can start running with it. And right, if I pass, let's say we get a request to do a webinar and I give it to the person on my team who runs webinars, there's a whole delegation system within that as well, right? So it's not just like a leadership thing, like, oh, you have to delegate to all your employees. It's actually delegating across the team, right? You think of a webinar, we have landing pages, we have emails, we have email sends, we have ad promotions, we've got creative, we've got the speakers we have to manage. We have all these different things. One person is not doing all that on our team. And so it's delegating within the project so that one request doesn't fall on the shoulders of one person to run the whole thing. And I think that really helps kind of free everyone up a little bit of like, okay, knowing your role on specific projects makes it a little bit easier to say like, oh, geez, okay, we have this. I know I have all these resources and these people here who can help me kind of get this done. And I think the worst thing people do is they try to take on projects themselves and just run with it all the way through themselves. And that's where you end up with a lot of that burnout. And honestly, like products that ship, whether it's a webinar or whatever, that just aren't as well kind of executed as they could be if you had more kind of cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah, absolutely. I love what you're saying there, Adam, about not only delegating at the highest level of leadership, but creating a culture of delegation. It's not always just throwing something off to the next person, but it's staying in your lane, because if we're all doing that properly, then there's actually more power. So we're going to start with delegation. And then the next thing, I know you and I chatted about this a little bit offline, is creating a recipe on your repeatable processes, starting with something and then going from there. Tell me a little bit. I think, you mentioned your webinars is probably a good example where you've developed a recipe and then been able to improve that over time, right?
Yeah. So I think when you think of like a webinar, right, all the different components, like you just say, oh, let's do a webinar. It sounds pretty simple, right? But people have done it before, realize like if you want to do it well and execute it and have it well attended and have good follow-up and turn that webinar into an evergreen campaign and do post surveys, like there's so much that goes into it. And so I think one of the things is like, once you do it once, every time you want to do a webinar, you have to sit down and make a list of all the things you want to do. You're definitely going to forget things. It's like cooking, right? If you don't have a recipe that you're following, unless you know it like the back of your hand, like my mom or something, when you ask her for a recipe, it's like, oh, I just put a little bit of this in, a little bit of that.
Yeah,
well, I'm not that good. doesn't work for me, right? And it's like, it's the same thing, right? I want everyone on the team to be able to run webinars. So when we do something, we document kind of a lot of what we're doing with the goal of building it that we can scale it, right? And so I think like that also allows us to do a couple things. Like in our post analysis, we can look back at the project and say like, okay, what didn't work? Like, okay, we didn't give creative enough time to do the landing page design, so they felt really rushed. So we should buffer that in for the next time. That we need 4 weeks out from the webinar to do it rather than 3 weeks out, whatever that could be, right? And that's just an example. And I think that does a couple of things. It allows you to fine tune the process and keep getting better and better every single time you're doing it. So not only do you have a process to do it, so you know exactly what you have to do, but then you can start fine tuning elements of that process. And so it helps a ton, I think, in terms of like, I touched on like the creative team feeling like they're getting these requests last minute. Well, that causes stress for them, back to the kind of the original conversation, right? And that keeps happening and happening and happening. People can only go 100 miles an hour for so long, they'll just get burnt out. And so I think like building in those processes and building that recipe or cookbook is something that we've been really hammering home here at G2. And I know, Matt Gorniak, our CRO is so big on like having processes and building the scale. So it's something I think that's pretty critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to your point there on just that example of the webinar and the creative team, if you've done it a few times, you start to set benchmarks and you know what timeline you should expect, how much the creative team needs for this, how much the team running email needs for that. And you don't set yourself up for undue stress because you've done it before and you've kind of monitored and iterated off of that initial recipe. So going from there, not to kind of mix metaphors, but we go from recipes. But I know another thing that you've talked about, Adam, is building out playbooks. So you start with something that you can iterate on to figure out, okay, what are our initial benchmarks? But then I love what you shared with me a little bit offline, what you guys are using some tools to do to take some of the work out when you start that recipe over again with some well-documented playbooks, right?
Yeah, so we've kind of built that process of what we're trying to do with the playbooks. And then we basically, after we do it once, turn that into a template that we start with for every next event we do. So if it's a webinar, if it's a campaign, so we're cloning that project basically and starting there. And I think those playbooks, you can do it in any project management software, right? But it really helps us understand everything that needs to go into it so that we're pulling in all the right people at the right time, but also helps you kind of optimize, I think, along the way, right? So as you know, like, you do a landing page for a webinar and it's like, okay, what was the conversion rate last time? You can start setting some benchmarks and it's like, okay, this didn't do that great. Let's tweak this time. But the other big benefit it gets you is when you talk about delegation. The reason people find delegation so scary is because you're passing something over and you're trusting that it's going to get done, right? But you're flying blind unless you really have something to look into and see like what's happening, right? So like maybe
right,
like, hey, I
exactly.
want to do a webinar for 4 months. Hey, can you do this? Great, cool. If I don't actually like follow up on that, and maybe I have to, and maybe I don't have to, but I'll have like nervous attacks in the middle of the night being like, geez, I wonder what's going on with that webinar, right? And I think like having a system allows me at any point in time to jump into those project templates and say like, okay, well, this isn't done. What's going on here? Or like, hey, this is moving along great, or we're ahead of schedule kind of thing. And so I don't need to sit down and have meetings and be brought up to speed. And we don't need, 500 people sitting on calls and all this sort of stuff. Like we can all just look at the project and manage the project that way. And if I have questions, I just throw it in there. And so it makes it very transparent. So at any point in time, I know I can look in. If sales asks me, hey, what's going on with this? I just jump in and look at it, right? I don't need to be constantly in the know of everything. And you're not going to be if you do a lot of things. It's just not scalable.
Right. And that's not leading to better delegation. To your first point here, Adam, I love what you're saying there. And we've seen the same thing, right? We've launched dozens of podcasts for brands. If we started from scratch on, hey, we're getting ready to launch a podcast for this company. Okay, what are we going to do first? No, we go with the repeatable process that we've honed over and over again in our project management tool. We happen to use Trello. There are other great ones out there, as you mentioned. So whether you use Asana or Basecamp or Airtable or Trello, setting yourself up with kind of that initial template allows you to delegate and also give visibility into the execution. So the last thing I know you wanted to touch on, Adam, you already kind of mentioned a little bit here, but it's something that allows managers to get out of the weeds. And that's going beyond just the template of what's going to get done and predefining who's going to own each task or each stage of a project, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think really that ownership piece of it, like I said, like one person most likely is not going to own the full breadth of a project, right? So if you think about a webinar, a trade show, like I said, even just within marketing alone, you have your creative team, you have content, you have, your actual like demand gen folks, you've got all your social team, you've got all these people probably involved in one project. So really defining like who owns what, like there might be a project leader, who's running point on all this stuff, but like they're delegating out all the different tasks. So like, the social media person knows if they're managing, in their project management tool, whether like you said, Trello, Asana, whatever, they can actually go in and see like all the projects and tasks being assigned to them without needing to be part of the entire conversation where you get pulled into meetings about, this upcoming event. And all I'm really doing is, creating the graphics. Do I need to sit through a 2-hour planning meeting, or can I just be assigned the task and know that I need to update the template?
It's a fantastic example.
And so I think it really helps alleviate that, but then also like they can fit it into their schedule. And back to like the initial point of like the burnout factor and the feel like I'm always being yo-yoed in 100 different directions and everything's a last minute project, kind of, the typical startup kind of burnout stories you hear is like you can avoid a lot of that because if you plan it accordingly, right, they'll have 6 weeks out or 8 weeks out when we clone the template to do something, they get assigned that task right then and there. And so they know, hey, in 3 weeks, I need to do, this piece of that project and they can plan accordingly, right? So I think it just helps kind of the overall project flow and everyone feel good about like their piece of it and that their time and their resources are being respected. And it also gives you as a manager a ton of visibility into like what's slowing things down or, what's working well or not working.
Yeah, absolutely. Adam, to recap, I think there are a lot of things that people can take from this conversation and apply right away, because there is obviously tons of opportunity for burnout for a number of factors that we've talked about in a high growth startup. And so we've talked about making sure that you delegate, but not only at the highest level, but build an organization where delegation is understood, how you do it properly, and then creating recipes that you can follow and tweak over time. And then within those, give yourself resources and templates to be able to copy and paste those. And then lastly, predefining who owns each task in those project templates that you build out in whatever tool you're using. So I love all of those, and I think they're very actionable for listeners. Adam, you've done it again. You've created some great value for listeners today. So anybody who's not connected with you yet would like to ask you any follow-up questions related to today's topic, or just stay in touch with you about anything marketing or what G2 Crowd is up to, what's the best way for them to find you or reach out, man?
Yeah, I think find me on LinkedIn and reach out to me there. And if you want to learn more about G2 Crowd, visit the site, whether you're looking for software solutions yourself, you're a vendor looking to get listed on there, or if you are a marketer who is looking for a job, we have or any really one in the SaaS space is looking for a job, we have about 100 job openings right now. So the delegation thing is going to be critical to bring those people on board, but we're hiring like crazy. So anyone who's looking, come our way.
I love it. Adam, this has been great, man. Thanks for joining us on the show again.
Okay. Thank you, Logan. I enjoyed it.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big Three, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.